just go over the Gemara before, the Gemara that we learned earlier, which was right at the turn of the page, right when we turned the page from 19a to 19b. The Gemara had compared the law of mikvah with the law of Sukkah. And the law of Sukkah, the Gemara said, had an interesting halacha that if you have empty space on your amongst your schach, that means that your schach, the minimum sukkah is supposed to be 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths, and you only have, let's say, 6 handbreadths or 5 handbreadths of schach, and your sukkah is the minimum size sukkah, so it's 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths, but the schach part does not cover the entire sukkah. There's empty space there. It'll actually be mitzdarif. It will join together and be considered a kosher sukkah. So even though a sukkah needs to have 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths, but you don't need 7 handbreadths of 7 handbreadths of schach. Even if you have, let's say, 5 handbreadths of schach, it'll still be a kosher sukkah because the empty space will fall under the category of lavud. And lavud will fill in that empty space and be considered as if it's kosher. It's called mitzdarif. It joins together and it makes it a kosher sukkah. But you're not allowed to sit under that empty space. And the Gemara said, do we ever have such a thing? That something is considered good enough to join together, but you won't be able to dwell under it. And the Gemara answered that, yeah, we have such a thing with mikvah. And what was the law of mikvah? The law of mikvah is that you sometimes can use, you sometimes have different material, different something different than water that will be considered mitzdarif to a mikvah, but at the same time, if a mikvah is made completely of it, an example that the Gemara gives is pourable mud. If you have pourable mud and you add that to a mikvah, and the mikvah doesn't have enough measure, 40 sa'ah is the measure of a mikvah, let's say it's about 200 gallons of water, and you don't have that, and you need more water, mikvah water, to make it a kosher mikvah. After you have a kosher mikvah, you can add as much water as you want. But the initial mikvah needs to have rainwater. You don't have enough rainwater. And so what do? You fill it with pourable mud. If you fill it with pourable mud, it actually is kosher. It's mitzdarif. It actually joins together. The pourable mud will join together with the mikvah, and it'll make it a kosher measure of a mikvah. Mikvah needs this 40 sa'ah, which is, I think, around 200 gallons. So if you have, let's say, 180 gallons, and you need another 20 gallons, you don't have it. You use pourable mud, and you join it together to the mikvah, it'll actually be a kosher mikvah. However, if you make a mikvah completely out of it, you cannot dunk in such a mikvah. Only if you use it to add. So sometimes something could be mitzdarif, can join together, but you can't actually use it to dunk in if the mikvah is fully made out of such a material, in other words, such a substance, which is pourable mud, that would not be a kosher mikvah. But if it's a kosher mikvah from rainwater, just doesn't have enough measure, so you have a substantial amount of rainwater, then you could add this to be mitzdarif, to join together. And so this is the way Rashi learned it. So what comes out, according to the way Rashi learns, is that it's not exactly the same comparison. In other words, we're not comparing apples with apples, but we're getting a general gist that there is a similarity because you have cases that something could join together, but there's also, even if it could join together, it's not completely a substance that's kosher. It's joinable, but it's not fully kosher. Why? Well, by the case of the sukkah, what do we have? Empty space. In the empty space of a sukkah, it joins together to make the measurement, but it's not a substance that you could sit under and eat or sleep. And by the mikvah, it joins together, the pourable mud joins together and makes it a kosher mikvah. But if a mikvah was made fully of this substance, you would not be able to use it. It would not be a kosher mikvah. So it's joinable, but it's not kosher in its own right. Tosfos doesn't like this comparison because it's not a perfect comparison. And Tosfos is bothered with the fact that if you want to compare the two, you got to compare apples with apples. And what does that mean? You got to compare when you join the pourable mud to the mikvah, are you allowed to dunk inside that pourable mud area, or do you need to dunk in the rainwater part of the mikvah? So Rashi didn't really get so much into this fact, and it seems that Rashi holds that you would be allowed to dunk inside the pourable mud because the majority is rainwater, and you're going to dunk in this mikvah. The mikvah is kosher. When is it not kosher? If the mikvah is made completely of this substance of pourable mud. That's when you can't dunk in the mikvah. But if you have pourable mud joining together with mikvah water, and all together that reaches the minimum size of a mikvah, a 40 sa'as it needs to have, and now it has it because you added the pourable mud. In that scenario, it's a kosher mikvah. The pourable mud adds to the mikvah, and you can dunk in it. So Tosfos says, but that's not similar to the sukkah, because the sukkah you're not allowed to sit under it. And here you are allowed to dunk in the pourable mud. So Tosfos concludes that, you know what, you have to learn the Gemara, that you cannot dunk in the pourable mud. And then it's exactly the same. Just like the mikvah, just like the sukkah. You have a sukkah, the empty space, it's mitzdaref, it joins together to make it a kosher sukkah, but you're not allowed to sit or sleep under that empty space. The same thing as the pourable mud. You can have it join and make a mikvah kosher, but you can't dunk inside that area that's pourable mud. You dunk in the water part of it, not in the pourable mud part of it. And therefore, Tosfos says it works perfectly now. Now it goes hand in hand. So it seems like there's an argument between Rashi and Tosfos if you're allowed to dunk in pourable mud inside a mikvah. So according to Tosfos, you're not allowed to dunk in the pourable mud part, but it is joinable for the mikvah minimum size. According to Rashi, you would be allowed to dunk even in the pourable mud. So that was the previous Gemara, and that concluded that discussion. And page 19b we actually have two Mishnahs. So the first Mishnah, on 19b talked about making a sukkah kamin tzrif, that you made a sukkah on a slope area. I'm sorry, you made a mikvah. What did I just say? A slope. Yeah, excuse me. Let me say that again. You made a sukkah kamin tzrif, you made a sukkah like a cone, or shesamcha l'kaisel, you made it with a slanted schach. And the schach was basically used as your wall and your schach and your roof. So this was a very interesting Mishnah because what comes out is that you have a very strange looking sukkah. Not only is it strange looking, but there's a lot of area in this sukkah that doesn't have the height that you normally need for a sukkah, which is 10 handbreadths. Here, what type of sukkah do you have? You have a sukkah that is, that's, well, at least the second case is you have a sukkah that's just bamboo sticks, let's say, leaning against a wall, and you're going to call that a sukkah. Well, in other words, you didn't build a sukkah. what did you do? You bought bamboo sticks and you just lean it against the wall. Oh, I have my sukkah. I have walls and I have a schach. Where do the walls end and where does the schach begin? We don't know. There's no area there that makes it clear that this is going to be the schach part and this is going to be the wall part. There's nothing that actually changes. It's all going along the same slant. And the first case was you made it kamin srif. Srif means some type of a cone where you're like a round type of structure that they would use in order to capture birds. And so it's some type of hut. It's made like a beehive, it says, and it gets it does slope down. So the problem is there's also not clear where the wall ends and where the roof begins. And so we had a machlokes in this case, these two cases, I should say. What is the halacha? So we have Rabbi Eliezer says this is not valid. You don't know what's the roof, what's the wall, so it's not kosher. The Chachamim said it's kosher. The rabbis say it's kosher, and it does boil down to the concept of oyel, tent. That in order for something to be a tent, could it be on a slope or does it have to be flat?
Support anywhere.
So the Gemara then says an interesting thing. It says that Rabbi Eliezer says that it's invalid. He says there is a scenario where it would be valid, and that is if you lift up the cone one hand breadth. So what ends up happening is if you lift it up one hand breadth, or if you lift up the slanted bamboo poles one hand breadth above the ground, so then we could say that you have the law of, you have the a separation between the roof and the walls. So you could call that walls, and it'll because it's recognizable, because there's a tefach, a handbreadth, that it's straight up. So you could tell that the tzrif is a gag. You could tell that that slanted bamboo sticks are really a roof, and that would be considered a kosher sukkah. And he gives another example where also Rabbi Eliezer would agree that if you move the slanted bamboo sticks from the wall one tefach, so what you have there is also a handbreadth that you can call a roof. Because you could call that a roof, that would be
recording in progress.
Okay, so the way it works is if you have a handbreadth of, in the way Rashi learns, here also we're going to see it's an argument between Rashi and Tosfos, but the way Rashi seems to understand it is there's double noise. It seems like you're on twice, Jeffrey, but it's okay. I'll just mute you, then it's no problem. Otherwise, well, I'll leave it like this. If I start hearing myself, I'm gonna have to mute one of them. Okay. In the meantime, I guess it's okay. It's good. I guess it's good now. So the Gemara is telling us a very interesting thing, that, or Bryce, I should say. The Bryce is telling us that Rabbi Eliezer, that argues with the rabbis in the Mishnah, but here in the Gemara he says, but there is a case where he actually says it's going to be a kosher. It's going to be a kosher. How is that? So one case was if you add a handbreadth on the bottom. Another case is where you add a handbreadth on the top. That would be a horizontal handbreadth. That means that there is a gap between these poles that were leaning on the wall. Instead, you put a gap there between the poles and the wall, a gap of a handbreadth. And what that does is that makes that the gap is called the roof, and the walls, the bamboo is called the walls. So you have a separation between walls and schach. It's recognizable. Now, if you look back in the Mishnah actually used this term, mipnei she'ein lo gad. The Mishnah said it doesn't have a roof. So once you correct that problem, so even Rabbi Eliezer is going to agree. However, the Gemara's way of correcting the problem is definitely interesting. It doesn't sound like that would be the normal way of correcting this problem by saying, "Oh, it's one handbreadth away." Oh, all of a sudden, you know what? Now I have a roof. You have a roof, especially with the way Rashi learns. You don't even have anything there. It's just empty space. You just put some pegs there to hold the bamboo poles away. So you somehow stuck something there that blocks the bamboo poles from hitting the wall. You have a handbreadth of empty space. And Rashi says, well, that's the roof, empty space. How do you have empty space as a roof? The answer is because you're using the law called Lavud. And Lavud was a law that we've seen throughout this chapter, that the law of Lavud means that empty space can be combined can be considered filled in if it's less than 3 handbreadths. That was a special law, halacha l'Moshe Sinai, a law given to Moses at Sinai, that Lavud makes it that it's considered filled in, and you now have a roof, an imaginary roof, but it's halachically considered a roof. It's good enough. It's filled in. And what was the other case? The other case was you had a tefach, a handbreadth below. And if you have a handbreadth of space below, so what happens is you could say that the empty space is considered a wall, and the schach, the bamboo that's slanted, it's all a part of the roof. It's all part of the roof. So that was the way the Rabbi Eliezer agrees that it's kosher. That's a way to kosher this sukkah. So you have that empty space. And basically, it's the same idea that you've clarified what do you need? Check on my windowsill. Our windowsill. So the way it works is that you've koshered the sukkah to make it clear what's the wall and where the roof starts, the roof begins. Now, Tosfos is not satisfied with learning it this way. And the reason is, it seems that Tosfos doesn't like this idea of using Lavud to say, now I have a recognizable roof. In other words, Lavud works, but not in this scenario. And so he says, it must be that you put something there. It must be that you have and Tosfos uses the term a binyan zokuf tefach. You have something, you've built something, like on the cone, let's say. You've built something below, and on that you put this cone, sukkah. But you built something straight up, that's a handbreadth tall, and the same thing applies that you moved away from the wall, a tefach, that you made some type of surface where the ledge that sticks out. And that's where you're putting the bamboo. Now, Tosfos's reason behind this is because it's taking it a little, you're taking it a step too far, maybe. That just because there's a law of lavud doesn't necessarily mean that lavud will make you a roof, a recognizable roof, or a recognizable wall. It's considered filled in. But to say and to make it to make it considered that you have now an area that's filled in and it's considered recognizable, not necessarily will that work. However, Tosfos does say, interestingly enough, he says, however, the Yerushalmi does sound like Rashi, because in the Yerushalmi, he brings a Yerushalmi that says that all you need is like 4 stones that the sukkah will be on, and it'll be a kosher sukkah. Or if it's above the ground, a handbreadth, it's kosher. And it sounds, peseach tefach sounds like the term used when you have an opening that's not filled in. Peseach tefach, that's what the term. So Tosfos does say that it definitely sounds from the Yerushalmi that it sounds from the Yerushalmi that it should work even with the law of lavud. So interestingly, you don't always find that Tosfos finds a proof for Rashi, but this is here you have Tosfos like showing that I learned it this way, but there is a Yerushalmi that does sound like sounds like the way Rashi learned it. And so bottom line is that regarding this Mishnah and the Brisa that explains the Mishnah, we have 2 ways of learning it. When you have that extra handbreadth, is that extra handbreadth an empty space, or is that handbreadth filled in with a solid material? And if it's filled in with a solid material, keep in mind the way Tosfos is learning, what it means is, what are you using? Let's say you have bamboo sticks, and then you have them 1 handbreadth away from the wall. So Rashi learns empty space, good enough. It's clear that there's schach here. You have a roof. Where's the roof? It's lavud. It's a special law of lavud, the way Rashi learns. An empty space, lavud. It's good. It's a good sukkah. You got 1 handbreadth. It's lavud. Okay, it's kosher. Tosfos says, no, you got to fill it in, because you can't use the law of lavud here to make it considered a recognizable wall. There's a difference between the wall and the schach. So what do? You need to have kosher schach on the top. It makes a major change. The way Rashi learns, you have empty space, no problem. Tosfos, no, you need to have kosher schach there, because that's going to be your roof. At least that's what your recognizable roof. What? I don't know what you said. But you need kosher schach for that roof. So that would be the way Tosfos learned. So here we have Rashi's way of learning and Tosfos's way of learning, and then there is one discussion here. I did touch upon it also on Tuesday, that there is another discussion here, and that is this another Tosfos on the side here. Tosfos deals with an issue of, imagine you have this like teepee looking sukkah. That's cone type of sukkah, however you want to imagine it. So it's somehow slanted, and it comes to a point, let's say on the top, 1 little point on the top. So we were dealing with an issue of how tall, do it outside, okay? How tall does this sukkah need to be? Well, we know the law is 10 handbreadths, and we know it needs to be 7 handbreadths wide. But the problem is, it's getting wider as it goes down, and it's getting, so the width, 7 handbreadths, needs to be at a certain place. seemingly in the height, does at the height of 10 handbreadths, does it have seven handbreadths width and length? That would be a question. And the Rishonim do argue and debate about this. And according to some, you don't really need all that as long as the wall has 17 handbreadths. It somehow works. You got 10 handbreadths of height and 7 handbreadths of width and length. That's considered good enough. So there are some lenient views here, but Tosfos over here wants to be machmir and says, no, you need to have the height of 10 handbreadths and 7 handbreadths width and length. Now, when you have that, now just think about this teeping. So let's say it has, at the height of 10 handbreadths, it's wide enough to have 7 by 7. So the Mishnah, according to the rabbis, says this is a kosher sukkah. Just think about a sukkah. You've got 4, I guess the simple way of making this sukkah would be, imagine if you have 4 mats, 4 kosher sukkah mats, and you just lean them all against each other. So you got so this would be maybe a simple example of this sukkah. You have 4 sukkah mats, you have no walls, and you're using the sukkah mats as your walls, and they're leaning against each other. And you've got yourself a sukkah, you make a little hole in there to climb in, and you're all set. So I'm giving that as an example of a tzrif. Tzrif sounds more like a cone, but let's say that's just for an example. We're just going to use that. So the thing is, so you need to have very tall. It must be very tall, this sukkah, because you need, according to Tosfos, you need to have 10 handbreadths height and 7 handbreadths width at the height of 10 handbreadths. So in other words, you can't just put some small schach mats next to each other. You're not going to have the 7 handbreadth width going up for 10 handbreadths. But let's say you do, you have somehow tall, you have the bigger mat. And ultimately, if you go up 10 handbreadths, you're going to have 7 handbreadths of width. Okay. So what you have now is, imagine a box of 7 handbreadths by 7 handbreadths. That's 10 handbreadths tall. It fits right into this sukkah. That's a kosher sukkah, according to the rabbis. Rabbi Eliezer doesn't like it. He says, you don't have it's not clear. What's the roof? What's the walls? But the rabbis say it's kosher. This is a good sukkah. So Tosfos says, we need to have the 10 by 10 height with 7 by 7. Okay, we got that. What about sitting on the side of this? What about sitting right next to the wall? You don't have a height of 10 handbreadths there. So once you have in the middle of this, what you call maybe a teepee, in the middle of this, you do have a height of 10 handbreadths, and you have 7 handbreadths width. So that's going to be kosher, no question. But what about sitting on the side of it, where the wall is right leaning against your back, and it goes right above your head? It's leaning right above you, and it's slanted, so you don't have 10 handbreadths. You're sitting down there. Would you be allowed to sit in that area of this teepee? And so on this, Tosfos tells us, he says, maybe you could say it's similar to Sol Hayoytze Min HaSukkah, to the law we learned about 2 weeks ago, that that the area that extends from a sukkah could still be kosher for a sukkah. So here you have an area that's under 10 handbreadths, and Tosfos says, just like you could have Sol Hayoytze Min HaSukkah extending from the front of the sukkah, you have an extension going out of the front of the sukkah. It only has one wall. It's kosher. So here also you have an extension going out of your sukkah area that has less than 10 handbreadths height. It's also going to be kosher. Tosfos says maybe you could say that. Why not? What would the problem be? So the problem seemingly would be that it's called a dira srucha. This is called a disgusting dwelling, and maybe even that, maybe you can't say it now. In the case of the Gemara, Psala Yotzim Min HaSukkah, which might be some type of halacha l'meisha Sinai, it's a special law, Psala Yotzim Min HaSukkah. There, what do you have there? You have at least a normal height. You don't have 3 walls, okay, but you have a 1 wall that goes along with it. It's at least a normal dwelling. Here, you don't. You have less than 10 handbreadths. When you're sitting next to the wall in this teepee, you got a very low ceiling. So this could be a problem. And this is why Tosfos seems to be unsure. Is it possible? Maybe, he says, after that you could maybe consider the side of it, Psal Hayotzim Min HaSukkah, and maybe it would be kosher even to sit on the side of this teepee, of this type of sukkah tzrif. Okay. Now, getting back to the Gemara. So that she basically shared with you some of the Tosfos over here. And now the Gemara had mentioned that Abaye found Rabbi Yosef, that he was sitting in a kilas chasanim, which was inside a sukkah. So the sukkah was, I guess a decent size, and in it was this kilas chasanim, and kilas chasanim is some type of a special bed that the newlyweds would use, and uses the term the groom's type of canopy bed, but so I'm not exactly sure what how it was, what the custom was in those days, but this is called the kila of the chasanim, of the groom, and it was some type of bed that was like it was a sheet, some type of material that would slope over the bed, like maybe similar to a teepee. But anyway, it came to a little point in the top, and it didn't have a hand breadth of tefach. So therefore, there's room to say that is considered an oihel, or maybe not an oihel. Now, if it's an oihel, you can't sit inside a tent, inside a sukkah, because then you're not sitting in the sukkah, you're sitting in the tent. So the question is, what is the law of a kilas chasanim? And the way the Gemara understood it is that it boils down to our Mishnah, because our Mishnah seems to deal with this issue of something that comes to a point on the top and doesn't have a full hand breadth of as schach. So this kilas chasanim, because it comes to a point, doesn't have a hand breadth. So it would seem that according to the rabbis in our Mishnah, they hold that would be a kosher sukkah. That means that they hold that could be considered an oil. That would be considered a tent, even though it doesn't have a hand breadth, flat. According to the Rabbi Eliezer, it seems that you need a flat space to be considered an oil. And so the Gemara wants to say, and Rabbi and Abaye seems to be bothered with this. Why is Rabbi Yosef sitting in this? He says, you're following Rabbi Eliezer, because according to Rabbi Eliezer, an oil needs to have a hand breadth. So that would be a reason why this would be a kosher sukkah, because even though you're sitting under a kilas chasanim, under this canopy inside the sukkah, but it's not considered a separate entity, it's considered nullified to the sukkah because it doesn't have a hand breadth of space. And that follows Rabbi Eliezer's view, which is a problem because the rabbis argue on it. So Abai asks Rabbi Yosef, he says, what, you're following Rabbi Eliezer? What about the rabbis? So the Gemara, so the Gemara tells us that the Rabbi Eliezer, that Rabbi Yosef answered him back that he has a brisa, and the brisa has the opinions switched around. So the rabbis are of this view, not Rabbi Eliezer. So Abai says, "What do you mean you don't follow a brisa when you have a Mishnah?" So he says, "No. Our Mishnah is actually a singular view. The brisa is the more authentic in this scenario. The brisa is more reliable because it's the view of the general opinion. The Mishnah was an individual's view, was a singular view. and that was and that's why Rabbi Yosef followed this opinion that you're allowed to sleep in a kilas chasanim inside a sukkah. And he brought the brisa, and that was the story of Rav Yosef sitting inside, dwelling inside this under the kilas chasanim. Okay, and now we have this new Mishnah which we started on Tuesday. So we're on Daf Yud Tes Amud Beis 19b. You want to look inside now? We're going to learn the new Gemara inside. That was a review. I mean, we did a little of this, but we're going to start it again now. And we're dealing with mats. And the mats in the olden days, they were either used for sitting on or they were used for roofing. And the problem with the mat that's being used as something that was sat upon is that if it's used for sitting, then even though it's a flat piece of wood or pieces of wood, it's considered mekabel tumah. It's susceptible to impurity because there's certain laws of impurity that have to do with sitting on things or lying on things. And it would be problematic to use something like that for schach. It would be invalid. Because this is non-kosher. This is susceptible to tumah, to impurity. We know that that's not valid for schach. On the other hand, if it's used for roofing, so that would be a reason why it would be kosher for schach, because it's flat wooden material. It's a flat piece of wood or pieces of wood, and they're not susceptible to impurity. Now, if it was metal, then you'd have numerous, you'd have other problems because a flat piece of metal is susceptible to impurity, but flat piece of wood is not susceptible to impurity, and therefore, if it's used for roofing, it would be kosher. Okay, so the Mishnah that we're going to learn is about maybe 15 or 20 lines from the top of the page. Machzeles kanim gedola. A mat of reeds that's large. Also, l'shchiva, if you made it specifically for sitting or lying on, to lay on, so mekabelas tumah, it's susceptible to impurity. And ve'ein mesachichin ban, you cannot use it for schach. L'sikoch, if you set it aside for schach, meaning you made it, when you made it, you had in mind that it's for schach, so it's for roofing, for shade. So mesachin ba, you could use it for schach. Ve'ena mekabelas tumah, it is not susceptible to impurity. Rabbi Eliezer, I'm here again. We have Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says that achas ketana v'achas gedola, whether it is small, whether it is big, also l'shchiva, if it's made for lying on, so mekabelas tumah ve'ein mesachichin ba, it's susceptible to impurity. You can't use it for schach. L'sikoch, if you made it for schach, then for shade and for roof. So mesachin ba, you can use it for schach. Ve'ena mekabelas tumah, it's not susceptible for impurity. So what we have here is a little confusing. And the reason it's confusing is because the Mishnah seems to imply opposite implications from the beginning part and from the end part. Because first the Mishnah says you have to have in mind for lying on this mat in order for it to be invalid for schach. And then the Mishnah seems to say that you have to have in mind for shade in order for it to be kosher for schach. So the implication from the first half is if you don't have in mind for lying on it, it should be kosher. The implication from the second half is that if you don't have in mind for schach, for shade, it would be not kosher. So there's a sort of like an implication that's contradictory from the first part of the Mishnah and the second part of the Mishnah. Then we have Rabbi Eliezer that says everything depends. It doesn't matter big or small. It all boils down to what you made it for. And again, it seems a little contradictory. Like what happens if you had nothing in mind? So we're going to see in the Gemara how to explain this. So Zok the Gemara. The Gemara says we're maybe about 20 lines up from the bottom. The Gimel, big Gimel Mem. Hagufa Kasha, this itself seems to be a contradiction. Amrit, you said also l'shchiva, mekabelas tuma, v'enusachimba. If you made it for lying on, it's susceptible to impurity, and you can't use for schach. Haimad also l'shchiva. The reason why it's not kosher is because you made it for lying on. Hastama, that means that if you just made it without having a specific intent in mind, automatically it should be kosher for usable for schach. L'sikoch, we assume if it's stam, we assume it's for sikoch, it's for shade and it's good. Because only when you have in mind for shchiva, for lying on it, that's when it's a problem. Then v'hadar tani, but afterwards, the Tana taught the opposite implication. L'sikoch is masakachin ba ve'ena makabelas tuma. If you had in mind for sikoch, for shade, then you could use it for schach, and it's not susceptible to impurity, and it's kosher. And so the Gemara says that implies taimadas and l'sikoch. The reason why it's kosher is because you had in mind for schach. You specifically had that intent. Hastama, what would happen if it was just stam, plain? You didn't have in mind anything specific. So we assume it's l'shchiva, it's meant for lying on, it would be invalid. So the words of the Tana Kama, of the first opinion, seem to be contradictory. So that's the Gemara's question. The question that I just asked while we learned the Mishnah, this is the Gemara's question, and the Gemara answers haloi kasha. The Gemara says, no, it's not a kasha, because you could differentiate between the first and the second case by saying kan b'gedola. The beginning part of the Mishnah was talking about a large mat. If you don't have any specific intent when you use a large mat, it's meant for roofing, for shade. It's not makabel tumah. It's not susceptible to impurity. It's kosher. But if you have in mind specifically for lying on it, then you can't use it for schach. It's invalid. So the Mishnah started off with those words, b'chseles konim gedola. When you have a large mat of reeds, if you have in mind for shchiva, for lying on it, then it's susceptible to impurity, and you can't use it for schach. And then the Mishnah says, what happens? L'sikoch. And when it says that, if you have in mind for schach, that's talking about a kan b'katana, the Gemara says. This is talking about for a small sukkah, for a small mat. When you have a small mat, what's the norm? The norm is that a small mat is meant for lying on. And therefore, if you have in mind specifically for schach, kosher, no problem. But if you don't have anything in mind clear, you didn't specify, you didn't have any specific intent, then we assume a small mat is to sit on. A big mat is used for schach. A small mat is used to sit on. So now we have answered the implications of our Mishnah, that the first case of the Mishnah implies one way. The second case of the Mishnah implies the opposite, because they're talking about two separate cases. One is talking about a large mat. The other is talking about a small mat. Now, the Gemara says, what about in Rabbi Eliezer's opinion? And there's a question about these words here. You see it's in parentheses, bishloima. So we'll just skip out those words. We're just going to go to the words Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, achas ketana v'achas gedola. Rabbi Eliezer says whether it's a small sukkah, whether it's a small mat, whether it's a big mat, also l'shchiva, if you made it with intent for lying on it, so then it's susceptible to impurity. Mekabelas tuma ve'ein masachichin, but it's invalid for schach. Taima, the reason that it's invalid is because you had in mind specifically dasa l'shchiva, you made it in order for lying on it, which makes it susceptible to impurity, which we explained earlier. Anything that's something is an item that's used to sit on or to lie on, it has a special type of tumah. Tumas mishkav or moishav, tumas medris. It basically causes a certain type of tumah that you put your weight on it, and it becomes tummy. So even though it's flat and it doesn't have a receptacle, it's considered impure because it's considered like a item for sitting or lying on. And so that would be this case. So now Rabbi Eliezer says, it doesn't matter how big it is, how small it is. If you have in mind for lying on it, that means that it's invalid. That means that it's not kosher. Now, what does that imply? Pastama, it implies that if you don't have in mind anything, it's kosher. It's only when you have in mind for shchiva, for lying on it, then it's problem. Then it's invalid, because now it's susceptible to impurity. If you don't have anything in mind, it's l'sikoch. We assume that you made it for roofing, for shade, for schach. It's not meant to sit on, to lie on. It's not susceptible to impurity. It's kosher for schach. So we assume it's meant for sikoch, for covering, for roof, and it would be kosher. That's what part of his statement implies. Then comes the other statement. And then comes his second half. Ema seifa, say the end. What's the end of his statement? Also, l'sikoch, if you have in mind for sikoch, for schach, you specifically have that in mind, then then you could use it for schach, and it's not susceptible to impurity. What does that imply? It implies that only when you have in mind specifically for schach is it kosher. But what happens if you have nothing in mind? We assume it's for shchiva, it's for lying on, and then it would not be kosher for schach. So the first half of his statement implies that stoma, you have nothing in mind, it's clear. You could assume it's for sikoch, it's kosher. The second part of his statement implies that if you have nothing clearly in mind, then it would be invalid. Why does he imply two opposite things? Let me say it inside. Ema seifa, say the seifa, or the end part of what Rabbi Eliezer says. Also, l'sikoch mesakachin ba ve'ena makabelas tumah. If you made it for schach, you could, if you had in mind specifically for schach, then you can use it for schach. It's not susceptible to impurity. At time, it sounds that implies time adasa l'sikoch. That's because you had in mind for sikoch. You specifically had that intent. Hastama, but if you just made a mat that you didn't have any specific intention in mind, and then we assume that it's l'shchiva, it's for lying on, and it would be invalid for schach. So the first half implies it's kosher, the case of stoma. Again, so what we're talking about is you've got to remember the lingo. The case in the Hebrew is called stoma, a case where you don't have anything specifically in mind. In the stoma case, the first half of Rabbi Eliezer's statement implies that it's kosher, and the second half of what Rabbi Eliezer says implies that stoma would be not kosher. Hastama is l'shchiva. It's meant for lying on, which would make it invalid for schach. So how do we answer Rabbi Eliezer? So therefore, the Gemara says we have to answer the Mishnah in a different way. And you know that when the Gemara says the word Ella, Ella like takes off the earlier explanation. Ella is like a retraction. We're retracting what we just said. Ella Amar Rava. Rather, Rava says the Gedoyla, a big mat, kulayalma loy pligi. No one even argues. This stamma lasiko, that it's stam is for siko. The stam case of a big mat, they don't use these big mats to sit on. So you sit on a small mat. A big mat, the people are not using it normally for sitting on. It's for slach, kosher. Ki pligi bektana. When do they argue? The first opinion and Rabbi Eliezer, they argue by a bekatana, by a small man. Tanakama Savar, the first opinion, the Tanakama, first view, holds stam katana l'shchiva. A small mat is stama, the case where he doesn't have anything specific in mind. It's meant for lying on. And it would be invalid for staff. That's the Tanakama's view. Rabbi Eliezer, Savar, Rabbi Eliezer holds stam katana nami l'si. Even the small mat is also stam. It's meant for roofing. It's not meant for sitting on or lying on, and therefore it's not susceptible to impurity. It's kosher for stuff. So it comes out that Rabbi Eliezer should be would be more lenient because he would say that the stam case, all mats are basically meant for roofing. That's the way Rabbi Eliezer holds. The first opinion held that no, the stam case, the big mats are meant for roofing. The small mats are meant for lying on. Now we turn the page. We're on page 28. 28. This is what they meant to say, and this is the meaning of the this is what he said. I should say this is what the Tanakama holds. Machzelas konim gedoyla, machzelas hakonim gedoyla. When it's a big mat, also the shchiva, if you have in mind for sitting on this or lying on this mat, mekabelas tuma, it will actually change its regular status. It's mekabel tuma. Ve'ein masakrin bon, you can't use it for schach, even though normally it's fine. But if you specifically have in mind for shchiva, for lying on it, then you ruin it. Otherwise, stam is kosher. It's a big mat. It's kosher. But you have in mind for shchiva, no, you ruined it. You can't use it for schach. Invalid. Haima da asa l'shchiva. And the reason is because you had that in mind. You're using it to lie on. Hastama, but if it's stam, it's made that it's as if it was made with intent for sikach, because that's the norm when you make a big mat, and therefore you could use it for schach. And this is what he says, l'sikach mesachrin, but it doesn't mean if you have in mind for schach. It means if you made it stam, it's as if you had in mind for schach. And therefore, the Tanakama is talking about a big mat that you have in mind specifically for shchiva. That's where it's a problem. It's makabel tuma, it's invalid. But if stam, if you make it, if it's just made stam, we assume it's for sikuch. Now, again, there's a parentheses over here, which seems like it's not. We're not supposed to read it. Generally, whenever there's a parentheses in the Gemara, you skip it. When there's brackets, you include it. So now comes Rabbi Eliezer. But also Rabbi Eliezer Lameima, and Rabbi Eliezer comes and says that Achas Gedoyla Achas gedoyla, achas katana v'achas gedoyla, whether it's small or whether it's big, stama shera l'siko. If you don't have anything in mind, it's assumable that it's for schach. So that's the way the Gemara Rava wants to explain our Mishnah, and the way, according to the way Rava's learning it, he specifically talks about a machatzeles gedoyla in the Mishnah, that if it's big, we assume it's for schach, and if you have in mind specifically for shchiva, then you changed it around. Now, according to this, it doesn't really tell us what's with a small mat, because we skipped those words. So we're going to learn the top Rashi here on page Chaf Amud Aleph, on page 20a, the top line in Rashi. Rashi is the inside of the page, the right side of the page on the top. V'hachi ka'amar, this is what the Tanakama means to say. Asa l'shchiva behedya, if you clearly have in mind that you made it for lying on, mikabelas tuma, it's susceptible to impurity. Ve'ein masakhin ba, you can't use it for schach because it's invalid, susceptible to impurity. It's made for shkiva, made for lying on. But if there's any way to say that it really is not made for shchiva, it's made for sikoch, it's made for roofing, if there's any way to say that, then we would assume that that's what it's for. Ve'echi dami, what would be a case like that? Could go and delay parish. He didn't specifically have anything in mind. He didn't delay parish. So then it's masakhin ba. He didn't specify that it's for anything else. Then we could assume that it's for sikoch. So then masakhin ba, you could use it for schach. Ve'ena makabelas tuma. And it comes out that with a large mat, everyone agrees, Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis agree, that it's for assumable that it's for schach, it's for a roofing purpose, for a shade, and it would be kosher for schach. In the case of stam, in the case where you didn't specify that it's for something else, we would assume that it's for schach. The Bein Tanakama, Bein Rabbi Eliezer, because both of them, whether the Tanakama or whether Rabbi Eliezer, they mention that a large mat is assumable for schach, is for roofing, and it's kosher. Ki plige bekatana. So what comes out is, when do they argue? They would argue on a small mat. Tanakama Shira lekatana of Loitanya, he left it out, and he didn't learn it mishum desavar, because he assumed gedoylahu the amrinan ba stama l'sikoch. It's the big one that we say is assumable for sikoch. You would imply haskatana stama l'shchiva, a small one is assumable for lying on, and therefore, if you have nothing in mind for a small one, we assume it's invalid for stach because it's for shchiva. So the way Rashi seems to be learning it is that we assume it's for a small one. We assume it's for shchiva, for lying on. It would be invalid for stach. But also Rabbi Eliezer l'meimar, and then Rabbi Eliezer says that the small one is just like the big one, and therefore we assume that it's always for schach unless you specifically have in mind for something else. Now, why does Rashi leave out? Why does Rashi not want to include those words? Why is it put in parentheses? So the reason is because the Mishnah, according to the way Rava's learning it, the Mishnah doesn't say anything about a small one. It's only assumed what he means. He's giving you it's not just assumed, it's implied. It's only implied. So therefore, when the Gemara is explaining the Mishnah, it's not going to say that, because the Mishnah doesn't mention it at all. But this is what's implied. And now you could look at the parentheses and it actually works. Ketana, if you look at the parentheses, ketana also a sikoch mesakhin ba. If you made it for sikoch, then you could use it for schach. because you had in mind, but stam, it would be assumed that it's for shchiva, ben mesachtin ba. It would be assumed that now, but the Mishnah didn't say those words. So he takes it out of the actual text of the Gemara because that's not part of the Mishnah, but it's the implication, but it's basically what's implied from the Mishnah, and that's what the way Rashi explains it. Okay, we're going to stop here. Have
Rabbi.
an easy one. Yes,
Rabbi.
no. Yes.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Is Rashi the one who puts it in parentheses?
So Rashi didn't put in parentheses, but the Gemara, the publisher who published the Gemara said that Rashi takes those words out, so he put the parentheses around it in order for us to know that according to Rashi, it's not supposed to be there.
Oh, okay.
Sei gesund, everyone. Have an easy fast.
Thank you.
Gebench the Yar. Sei gesund.
Thank you, Rabbi.